topics that's really close to my heart, to my academic heart, because I've been working on it for the past sort of year. So I'm really excited. And without further ado, I guess let's just get into the housekeeping, just because I know that we're sort of falling short on time, and I want us to have as much time for the Q&A as we possibly can. So before I introduce our speakers, a couple of things to note that perhaps you've already heard from the first panel, but just to reiterate. If your paper has content warnings, please mention them at the beginning of the talk. As of right now, I don't have any of that information. But if there is a change, please do mention that before. Q&A etiquette is the same as the previous panel, where you can either ask your question by posting it in the chat. Please do let us know if who you're addressing it to, and we'll read it out. Or you can also raise your hand and then we can unmute you and then have your question heard. Please mute yourself throughout the panel unless you're called upon to ask your question. The rest of the time, please keep yourself muted and sort of follow the general etiquette. We have 2 featured speakers and 2 normal presenters at this panel as well. So just a reminder on the times that are allotted. Featured speakers get anywhere between 20 and 30 minutes, but we'd recommend that you sort of try and start closing your presentations perhaps after the 20-25 minute mark, just because we are sort of running behind. And for the other presenters, Sumaira and Maryam Altaf, you get 15 minutes. I will be giving a sort of warning, a 2-minute warning, but I don't want to interrupt you in the middle of your talks. So I'm just gonna play this at the 2-minute warning. So keep sort of ear out for that. Hope you can hear that, just because it's awkward to stop a presentation in the middle. That being said, if you do go over, then I'll have to sort of jump in. Is there anything else? Yeah, the accessibility break that we initially planned to have, we're not so sure if we'll sort of be able to do that. It's still sort of in the air. If we do feel that we're running short on time, we might actually have to cancel it, just because then we can give people time at the end of the panel before we have our keynote address. Right, I think that's all. So without further ado, let me just invite our first speaker, Professor Siobhan Lambert-Hurley, who's going to be talking to us about her recently published book that I'm really excited to read. It's 3 centuries of travel writing by Muslim women, which she's going to be introducing for us today. The title of her talk is Reorienting the Global, Introducing 3 Centuries of Travel Writing by Muslim Women. Professor Siobhan, if you want to share your screen. Hi, thank you so much for joining us.
I've just tried to share my screen, and I tried, oh, there we go. I found it now. It wouldn't, it disappeared on me. Okay, there we go.
Yeah, we can see it.
Perfect. And I will just, from the beginning. There we go. We all sorted? Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much for your introduction, Sheila. And I'm really, really grateful to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to open this panel on travel, migration, and mobility. And I'm going to be doing so, as my title suggests, by talking about a book collection that, as you said, happily came out this week. You can see from my slide here that it's called 3 Centuries of Travel Writing by Muslim Women. So I'm going to be introducing the book, and I'm going to be doing so especially by focusing on the book's broader significance to history and literature in terms of my theme of reorienting the global. Now, let me start today by reading you an excerpt from one chapter in the book, and this is a translation from Farsi as part of a travel narrative written by a woman who was not from South Asia, but who may still be familiar to at least some of you, the Iranian feminist Siddiqui Dolatabadi, who lived and worked in the first half of the 20th century. And of course, you can see an image of her here on my slide, as well as her dates, that she lived from 1882 to 1961. Now, she traveled from Iran for the first time in 1923, when she was actually in her early 40s. And she didn't write a fully fledged travelogue, but instead captured her experiences in a series of articles and letters that were published in various Persian newspapers. The one which I'm going to quote from was only published in 1945, many years after her journey, in a newspaper that she herself edited. And I think you'll notice, those of you who are literature experts will notice that she really uses dialogue here to really interesting effect. So she basically captures a very long exchange that she had with a French immigration officer when she arrived in Marseille in 1923. So she writes, "Here is my passport. Are you Iranian? You must certainly be Armenian Iranian, isn't it? I'm Iranian, but not Armenian. You can't be Muslim. Perhaps you are Jewish. No, sir, I am not Jewish. Not only have my ancestors been of Muslim and Iranian origin for generations, but my father was one of the Muslim jurists of his time. I can't believe that I am facing a Muslim and Iranian woman. Now tell me, with whom have you come all this way? I mean, who has brought you? I traveled alone, though God was with me everywhere." The official made a gesture of surprise. "My God, mon Dieu, a Muslim Iranian woman has traveled alone from Tehran to France. How did your government permit you to leave? Where did you get this passport?" And it goes on from there. Now, I start with this exchange, even though it's not by a South Asian woman, because I think it really captures many assumptions that are out there about Muslim women travelers, not just in the past, but perhaps now too. Perhaps an assumption that because of constraints on women's mobility in Islam, that Muslim women simply aren't travelers. And if they are, that they face all kinds of specific challenges. The need for a male guardian, as we see in the extract that I've just read you, the difficulty of making travel work with practices of veiling and seclusion, something also I think implicit in this extract, and many other things too. Now, whatever our backgrounds, I think it's not too surprising that these assumptions may be floating about, partly because they reaffirm certain colonial or Orientalist suppositions that may remain alive and well in the present, and partly because outside those, I think, involved in this panel, and indeed this conference more generally, very few people have access to the historical record about Muslim women's mobility in the past. So let me introduce this book. And this is a book that really is about kind of making that historical record available to a much bigger audience. And it does so specifically by gathering, translating, and contextualizing women's travel writings that were written over 3 centuries. And within the book, there's really an emphasis, I would say, on kind of capturing women's own voices. And I think what we'll see as we put it in the introduction, that many of these voices kind of belie our assumptions. On other occasions, they affirm or inflect others. So in the rest of my talk today, I'm going to be kind of drawing mostly on our introduction to make my arguments, but I also really wanted to intersperse them with plenty of quotes from the extracts in the book. And I wanted to do this in order to foreground women's voices, but also to really give you a kind of flavor of the materials that are available here. And of course, I do so with appropriate thanks to my collaborators on this project who are pictured on this slide, Sunil Sharma and also Daniel Makiewicz, as well as our many contributors. So you'll see here that the South Asian chapters alone were produced in part by Daniel, Sunil, and myself, all South Asianists ourselves, but also by the 4 that you see at the bottom of my slide here. So what does this book look like in very practical terms? I'm looking for a copy as I say this. Well, first point to make is that it's a big book. It surprised me when I took it out of the box in that it's quite heavy. It's over 500 pages. It consists, as I've suggested already, of a fairly lengthy academic introduction, from which, as I said, I'm drawing from today. It's then followed by 45 small chapters, each of which is actually named for a woman traveler, each of whom wrote about her experience. Now, I realize this slide is super text heavy, but it gives you an overview of the table of contents. From this slide, you can see from the bits in blue that the book is divided into 4 different thematic sections, and we've organized it by the different motivations to travel that were identified by the authors themselves. So you'll see that the first and longest section of the book focuses on travel as pilgrimage. And this is perhaps not surprising that we foreground this, being that religious pilgrimage was the longest, most consistent, and best accepted type of travel by women. The second section then focuses on what really became a kind of major impetus to travel from the 19th century. So we call this section Travel as Emancipation and Politics. And I should note that when we talk about kind of political impetuses to travel here, some of these were individual, some of these were due to government assignments or being part of some kind of delegation, and the impetuses were really wide. So some of them might have been feminist, I guess, in its broadest implications, but they also are nationalist, internationalist, and communist as well. The third section is then entitled Travel as Education. And this really reflects how Muslim women began writing about their experiences of study abroad, as we would call it now, from the early 20th century. And here we've captured not just formal learning, but also informal learning, things like training programs, university courses, educational schemes, etc. And then the final section is called Travel for Obligation and Pleasure. And I guess what this section really reflects is that for many women, travel was really about commitments to their family. So perhaps accompanying fathers, brothers, husbands as they traveled into exile for work or study, or especially as time moved on, so from the early 20th century onwards, for recreation as well. Now, obvious, I think that we probably take some liberty in placing authors in one section or another, partly because their motivations might be kind of private and public and multiple all at once. So things like the Hajj, as many have shown, are often as much about politics as piety. But yeah, they're fitting in the way that they are. Perhaps also worth noting that one kind of unexpected outcome to us, at least, of this thematic organization was that we came to realize that travel writing had some very peculiar regional specificities. So for instance, we found no Arab or Southeast Asian pilgrimage narratives from before 1950. Well, all of our Arab and Turkish texts fell into part 2 on emancipation and politics. We also came to realize that there was far more travel writing being produced in South Asia than anywhere else in the Muslim world, which of course is good for this audience today. Now, if I kind of focus in on some of the individual chapters within each section, I can say that each chapter is kind of in 2 main parts. Each chapter has an introduction, which provides some biographical information about the author, as well as historical and literary context for her travel and travel writing, as well as a little bit of textual analysis. And then the biggest chunk of each chapter is dedicated to excerpts from a woman's writing. Almost all of these have been translated, usually for the first time, from one of 10 different languages, including from South Asia, Urdu, Punjabi, Bengali, and Persian. And then each chapter is rounded off with a short list of further reading, usually which also links to our project website, which I hope may be familiar to some of you already. That's called Accessing Muslim Lives, and you can see the link on my slide here. Here we provide kind of supplementary material in digital form, including additional translations. We also provide all the original texts here, which we felt was really important in light of the kind of politics of translation, and some visual sources too. And perhaps this is a good moment to note that I think a lot of the materials that we include in this book are often very rare, perhaps only existing in a single copy now. Sometimes they were found in quite obscure or inaccessible locations. So as we put it in the introduction, we hope this will be a bounty of newly discovered writing, much of which has often been lost actually to the kind of literary traditions out of which it grew. And as you can imagine, it's taken quite a lot of detective work over many years to put this together. And I certainly don't claim that we found everything. Indeed, as we were finishing the book, as it was going to press, people kept writing to us and saying, well, have you looked at this? Have you looked at that? So we just, I mean, I think it's nice that I'm opening the panel, because in a way, I think we see this book as a kind of opening to much more work in this area, which I hope will be taken on by many in this panel, and exemplified by this panel too. So hopefully that's a good segue to telling you a little bit more about the writings and our authors. The book is called 3 Centuries. That probably points to the fact that we include a span from the 17th century up until the mid-20th century. So our cutoff point is the transformative arrival of the jet engine on the transatlantic commercial routes in 1958. And we chose that point because we felt that the introduction of that kind of travel brought so many changes to how and why women wrote about travel, and how they traveled as well. Now, obviously, all of our authors are women. They're all female, but incredibly diverse. As we put in our introduction, they take in queens, reformers, pilgrims, Sufis, wives, converts, captives, flâneurs, littérateurs, and provocateurs. And you can just see some images which are from the book, of a few of them on my slide here. They are equally diverse in terms of their origins and also their destinations. So our authors hailed from many locations in Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe, though of course I'm only focusing on the ones from South Asia today, and they crisscrossed the globe. So they certainly were not limited by that kind of quintessential imperial journey between metropole and colony. So if we look at the South Asian chapters alone, we can see they traveled to Arabia, the Levant, Egypt, Turkey, Iran, Britain, France, Germany, the United States, and many other places as well. Now, unfortunately, for all this variety that I've just highlighted, few of our authors really disrupt the association between travel and privilege. And that's particularly because of requirements for literacy. Many of you will be familiar already that in India in 1901, for instance, the literacy rates were less than 1% amongst Muslim women. So most of our authors were privileged, and often highly so, but a few of them did have more modest backgrounds. And I thought I would just point to one example here in the form of Noor Begum, who, as we describe her, was not elite or urbane or even particularly wealthy. She came from a small village in Punjab, and she left there in 1931 to perform the Hajj. And it meant that she traveled overland, first of all to Karachi. So she took a train to Karachi. She then took a steamship to Jeddah. She then traveled to Mecca and Medina by camel at a time when many wealthier travelers in the book were actually going by motor car. And ultimately, she wrote a wonderful account of her experience in Punjabi verse, and you see the cover of her book here. This was published in 1933. And I thought I just might read you a few stanzas that she writes about boarding the ship in Karachi, and I think it really gives you a sense kind of this humble Haji as she describes herself. She says, "Many of the passengers climbed aboard with absolute ease. But then it was our turn, we who had never boarded a ship before. We poor people said Bismillah and placed our feet on the stairway. Our hearts grew fearful as we saw the vessel rolling in the waves. We were astonished, our weak hearts filled with fear. So vexed were we that we could not utter a sound. Then the people from Karachi came out onto the quay, and when the ship began to move, they threw up their hands and cried. All of the people began to wail as the anchor was weighed, as though death had set upon the Hajis that day. When the ship began to move, though, the Hajis fell silent. Some lay down, others stretched out, and all drank from the cup of patience." So hopefully that gives you a little sense of her. Whatever the social status of our authors, most of these authors consciously identified as Muslim. And very often they used their travel writings to kind of meaningfully engage with what that meant, whether from a religious point of view or from a more kind of social and cultural perspective. At the same time, we find, as the women travelers themselves did, that there was no single perspective or experience that adhered to this category of the Muslim woman. Perhaps inevitably, the positionality of our authors was determined not just by their gender or creed, but as often and often principally by other factors as well. So things like cultural background, race, class, politics, and of course, individuality. I think it's really notable too that many of these authors often found their kind of ideas of community and Islamic practice challenged by the experience of travel. So one thing that we really find in the Hajj narratives, for example, is that these women often traveled expecting to find themselves kind of enveloped by a strong sense of belonging to the Ummah, of belonging to a universal Muslim community, a kind of heightened sense of Muslim unity. But on the contrary, the experience of being kind of butted up against other Muslims, whether from their region or area or from elsewhere, whether it be on a Hajj ship or in the Hijaz itself, really actually had the opposite effect. In other words, it tended to kind of reinforce separate national, ethnic, or status identities that sometimes reinforced the value of one's own local practices, or in others undermined them. So I thought I might give you another quote here from perhaps one of my favorite authors in the whole book, Raheel Begum Shivania, who was from a prominent and accomplished Aligarh family associated with Islamic modernism. She traveled on Hajj in 1923, but only published her narrative a few years later in 1929. And this fits very nicely with my current work on food too, because she really used food to distinguish between the Indian Muslims aboard a Hajj ship and the Meccan Muslims they were going to visit. So she says, I asked her, which is one of her fellow first-class passengers, what sort of disaster she was expecting that she would bring so many supplies with her. She replied, sister, we wouldn't be able to bear Mecca Sharif's stinking ghee for a single day. Why? Aren't the residents of Mecca human too? Human or not, everyone has their own habits and tastes. We'd rather eat boiled food than their ghee. Even if we have to go without food for 4 days, we won't put that ghee in our mouths. To which I replied, well, then you yourself should take my canister of ghee. I will eat that sticky, rotten ghee instead. She said, the wheat there is so bad it clogs up your intestines, and proceeded to trash every single grain in Mecca Sharif. There were about 12 women there, each of whom took a turn to sing the highest praises of the items they had brought with them, and to try and scare me by impressing upon me my impending suffering. Now we can see here her being extremely vicious to the Meccan Muslims she was going to visit, but interestingly, she was just as vicious towards other Indian Muslims as well, with whom she traveled, and particularly those who came from other status groups or other regions within India. Her greatest anger was directed at Bengalis and Biharis, especially. She wrote, may God never ask us to travel with them again. So it really, I think her narrative really gives us kind of sense of the engaging, astute, and often acerbic quality of her narrative. But I think it also really gives us a sense of how this book is a kind of mediation, if you like, on the inherent diversity within Islam. There are just so many experiences that we capture in the book, and so few of them overlap, that their mere kind of juxtaposition, both within individual narratives, as we see here, and between them, is a really potent reminder, I think, to us of just how Islam's a category can be as limiting as it is enabling. Now, in terms of this quality of diversity within Islam, I should note that it has kind of influenced our choosing of extracts as well. We've tended to focus in choosing our extracts, as the women themselves did, on their experiences of other women. These were often other Muslim women, but sometimes those from other communities too. So a real focus of our extracts is on these kind of social interactions between women of different cultural and linguistic boundaries. Now, there are, of course, innumerable examples of this in the book, in every chapter, in fact. But I thought I'd just draw out one from the chapter on the woman you see on my screen now, Begum Sarbulanjang. She was the wife of the Chief Justice of Hyderabad. at the time of her trip to Damascus in 1909. And her book, which was not published until many decades later, was actually entitled Dunya Aurat Ki Nazar Mein, The World as Seen by a Woman. And of course, the title really points to how she is really explicit that her perspective is valuable because she is offering a woman's take on other women's lives. Now, she, as I mentioned, traveled with her husband, and this couple were perhaps the opposite of Raheel Begum Shivania that I just quoted, in that they were very much inspired by a kind of pan-Islamic ideal. So they were really wanting to kind of play down ethnic or regional differences between Muslims. So Begum Sarbalanjung was consciously kind of seeking out a sense of Muslim sisterhood through her travels, but inevitably found this kind of challenged as she was faced with linguistic and cultural differences. So one thing we see with her is she tries to learn Arabic so that she can have kind of open conversations, and she includes Arabic speech in her account. But for anyone who knows Arabic, they will see that it is what we've described as functional but broken. And we've tried to kind of indicate that in our translation. So I just thought I'd exemplify this with a really wonderful passage, which comes from a section entitled Everyone's Naked in the Bathhouse. I've got quite a long section here. I'll probably have to cut it off due to time, but I'll read as much as I can. The two of us set off from the hotel, she and her husband, and found two hammams nearby, one for men, the other for women. I knocked on the door and a woman appeared from inside. When she saw me, she said, "Welcome, come in, come in." I agreed and went inside, where I saw 30 or 40 women gathered. I paused, thinking to myself that I was in quite the dilemma. I'll wait to begin my bath, I thought, until everyone else is finished. I was standing there waiting when a woman came up to me, took the bag from my hand and began to remove my clothes. I said, "Wait, wait." And she retorted, "No, hurry," and said God knows what else in Arabic. I went silent when I saw that she had no intention of listening to me. She took off all my clothes. I wrapped myself in a towel and she took me by the hand and led me away. When I stepped foot into the next room, my feet were immediately burned. I said, "Hey, you tyrant, hang on, my feet are burning." But she kept on dragging me, saying, "Come on, come inside." And she goes on then to talk about how the women begin to wash her, and how she compares this situation to the situation in India. And she says, in India, the hammam is at home. We wouldn't uncover ourselves in front of all these people. I am astonished by the situation. And she basically tries to get out of there as quickly as possible, saying, "My husband's waiting for me outside. Let me go, let me go." And it goes on from there. So we can see some kind of interesting parallels with the panel we were just in about kind of ideas about showing women's bodies and differences between contexts and that. Now, the fact that this narrative was written in the form of a daily diary, this excerpt's dated the 7th of December 1909, I think also encourages me to make a more general point about nomenclature and form. Now you'll note that we've used travel writing rather than travelogue in our title, and we do this very purposefully to enable the inclusion of a much more kind of expansive set of materials in this collection. Indeed, we find that the forms that women chose and had access to were often gendered, with men more likely to write cohesive first-hand prose narratives in book form, and women much more likely to kind of respond to their circumstances to find other ways to write about travel. So some of the authors here have written what we might kind of instinctively think of as a travelogue, even if they're more quotidian and less formulaic than we might expect of those of men. But others, extracts we've taken are excerpted from autobiographical writing, or they take the form of magazine articles. Some of them started life as private letters or diary entries. A couple of them come from public lectures. A couple, like Noor Begum's that I've talked about already, were written in rhyming couplets. And I think that really points to how these source materials tended to fit much more closely with the kind of reigning literary aesthetics of the cultures out of which they came, rather than necessarily having any kind of association with colonial epistemologies. Now, I noted at the start that as well as introducing the collection, what I'd really like to do today is kind of to highlight the scholarly contribution of this kind of collection. Sorry, I'm just noticing my time. I've only got about 5 minutes. Is that right? Yeah. So really what we want to do with this collection is to kind of integrate gendered subjectivities into a much deeper understanding of our global past. And so this book is really crafted in such a way that we hope it will be of interest to students and general readers, but also scholars and specialists. And I guess the first point that I wanted to make here is that a collection of this source is really about making available to global, international, and imperial history a type of historical source that is rarely employed in their service. So one of the critiques that we've seen of global history in recent years, and I'm thinking here of Jeremy Edelman's provocation, is that global history has become another Anglospheric invention to integrate the other into cosmopolitan narratives on our own terms in our own tongues. Now, I'm fully aware that a book of translation isn't the perfect antidote here, but I'm hoping that something like this will at least open the eyes of the kind of average historian with globalizing ambitions, as we put it into the introduction, to what they're missing. And I think that opening up this kind of source can also really nuance our understanding of global processes. So another critique of global history is that it's full of do-good storytelling that intends to emphasize our cosmopolitan commonness facilitated by motion, rather than being attentive to those who didn't travel, but instead stayed at home. And I think I've probably suggested by the quotes that I've already shared, these categories are actually far from dichotomous. So as we put in the introduction, connecting need not mean sharing, being in motion can still herald exclusion. So some of the authors in our collection really reveled in the kind of Muslim solidarity that they experienced on Hajj, for instance. One example I had wanted to give you was from an account by Kayseri Begum, who's the granddaughter of the well-known Urdu language novelist, Deputy Nazir Ahmed, who wrote about her Hajj in 1936. And she just really expresses the kind of sheer joy that she gets out of praying with those of all nations and colors, rich and poor, male and female, on equal footing before the Holy Kaaba. Yeah, so there's a real kind of joy there of connecting. At the same time, I think it's probably quite clear from the two excerpts that I read already from Raheel Begum and Begum Sarbalanjung that even if one was looking for commonality, as in the latter case, sometimes that commonness never came. And I think we can see that women who traveled from colonized territories to Europe reacted with a kind of equal ambivalence to the connections facilitated by motion. So a few pointed to ostracism and the racial abuse that tended to kind of parallel the experience of male travelers, but many forged quite important friendships across the strict binaries of West and East, colonizer and colonized. Indeed, I think we would say that for elite women, at least, curiosity to them seemed more the norm. And I think here particularly of a quite charming passage in the account of Safia Jabir Ali, who traveled to Britain after the First World War around 1919 with her husband. He had a hardware business, so it took them right off all of the kind of the beaten track of the usual tourist haunts. So she found herself in the Rosyth Naval Dockyard in the Firth of Forth in Fife in Scotland. And she was faced with a whole bunch of children who kept running up to her and presenting her with flowers, wondering, as she says, what would this dark lady say in response? And she's quite charmed by this, by this interaction. Of course, British curiosity was not always received with equanimity. And we might point here to another one of my favorite chapters, which is on Begum Enam Habibullah, who was the great-grandmother of the well-known novelist Kamala Shamsi. She was from a talakdari or landlord background in the United Provinces, and she visited Britain with her husband and young daughter in 1924 to meet her three sons at boarding school in Dorset. She writes with absolute derision of a meal out at a London restaurant when she's completely upset because everybody stares at her all the time. And she says, staring is very bad manners in Britain. And yet they are determined to look at the Hindustani party. And she goes on then, more lovely food. She says, the food, I think, can't but taste bad to a Hindustani. And she says how much she has grown to detest this. So we can see how we can, how her kind of complaints, I suppose, about British cuisine show how travel could often result in this kind of cultural entrenchment, actually, rather than any kind of vaunted open-mindedness. Indeed, a lengthy stay in early 20th century Europe or North America only convinced many female travelers that Western culture and society did not live up to its billing. And I think here of authors like Mohammadi Begum, who came from Hyderabad to study at Oxford in the early 1930s, who advocated acting on the principle, adopt which is good and reject that which is not. So she talked about the flood of evils that was coming from British culture. So hopefully what these few examples, and I'm just rounding up, what these examples that I've provided today point to is the kind of complex renegotiation of global geographies required by these travel writings. Too often we get kind of stuck in this recurrent Victorian metaphor of the voyage out, implying that there's some kind of one-way traffic between imperial core and colonial periphery. But I think to sort of trace the convoluted paths of Muslim women travelers is really to disrupt one of the primary assumptions of Eurocentrism, that people and knowledge and ideas somehow radiate outward from the West to the West to the rest. So I think to incorporate the kind of perspectives that we share in this book into one's scholarship, into one's teaching, is really part of the transformation required to decolonize history, as we're all discussing all the time now. As we put it in the introduction, they really enable us to critically reflect on the privileging and marginalization of certain voices in history, while bringing the past to bear on our contemporary debates about globalization, migration, and decolonization. And I think that's a good place to stop. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was Professor Lambert-Hurley, who's the professor of history at the University of Sheffield. I add belatedly, since I forgot to introduce you. But thank you so much for your talk. And I urge everyone who's sort of enjoyed this presentation to pick up this book, order it for your libraries. If you're unable to sort of afford it, make your universities purchase and share this, because I think it's such a treat. And there is so much in this book, in this collection, that we can all sort of be inspired by. And I have questions, but I sort of keep them to the end. Next, we have Sumaira Nawaz, who is a PhD candidate at McGill University. She's going to be presenting on the topic East is East and West is West, an account of Nazli Faizi and Begum Sarbulam Jung's travels in Europe. So one of the writers that Siobhan sort of highlighted, Sumaira is sort of going to highlight, and can't wait for that. So thank you so much for joining us, Sumaira. If you'd like to just share your screen, let's see if that works. If not, just let me know.
Sure. Can you hear me though?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. And this is my slide share. I would just start with thanking the organizers, and also what a privilege it is to follow Professor Lambert-Hurley, whose work single-handedly inspired this essay that I worked on. And I have pointed out, most translations are mine, but sections that I have taken from Accessing Muslim Lives, I've pointed it out. So without any delay, I'll start with my presentation. So in 1917, Maulvi Bashiruddin Ahmad published a satirical column in Tehzeeb-e-Niswa titled Roz Namcha Nigari. In it, he gave a glimpse of the so-called slatternly lives of his own household women, mocking their incapability of abiding by the discipline that diary writing required. Your newspaper, that is Tehzeeb-e-Niswa, is busy these days explaining the benefits of diary writing to women. While trying to squeeze blood from a turnip, the newspaper is also implying that at the end of the year, your readers will think over its impact and reform accordingly. I'm sure there are women out there who are conscious of their time, but I haven't met any such. What diaries or Roz Namcha will women of our houses write? They will simply cry over what's been written in their fate. So Maulvi Bashiruddin's article, although critical and sardonic, perhaps satirical even, is emblematic of the kind of vibrant modern Urdu literary culture that was developing through the last quarter of the 19th century. It provided, or I tried to provide, literate elite men and women with an accessible, somewhat relatively equalizing zone through which they could portray, critique, and comment on modern daily life within the confines of sharafat or respectability. The genre under discussion, Roz Namcha, had become part of an autobiographical tradition in India by the early 19th century, when Indo-Muslim authors began applying it to personal accounts of daily activities and observations that were quotidian, exceptional, or travel-related. Although early examples of Mughal texts that self-identified as Roznamcha do exist, they were not part of a literary tradition like that of the autobiography, that is Waqai, and travelogue, Sayyah-nama or Safarnama. They were identified more as public documents that accounted for daily bureaucratic occurrences, including reports of markets, collections of land revenues, and daily price lists from the Pargana. Women's periodicals, on the other hand, like Ismat, Tehzeebul Akhlaq, and Khatun, alongside poetry, moralizing short stories, and polemical articles, often published serialized accounts of travels that were written in the form of regular personal diary entries and later transmitted through networks of post into print almost contemporaneously. Women emerged as an exclusive community of readers for the first time in colonial South Asia after the Allahabad Gazette's notification of 1868. And it called for useful works in the vernacular suitable for the women of India. Consequently, domesticity and feminine piety became an issue of public debate among Hindu and Muslim social reformers alike. But inculcating the habit of reading among women came at the cost of exposing their nazuk fitrat, delicate temperaments, to kaghazi dushman, paper enemies. Although reading in solitude was marked out as a source of pleasure, aish, and masarrat, delight, articles repeatedly forewarned against the corrupting effect of all those periodicals that publish obscene articles or that express depraved emotions in verse form. They are absolutely not worthy of being read by educated girls and women of Sharif households. Such public debates in women's journals surrounding appropriate reading and consequently writing practices further underscored the centrality of print culture in shaping female selfhood. So in the section that I cover, I will examine respectable gendered mode of fashioning the self in a particular genre, that is the travelogue. I will use as case study travel narratives of two women who had been actively involved in promoting women's education in India, Begum of Janjira, Nazli Rafia Sultana Faizi, and her travel account, Sere Europe, and Begum Hamidullah Sarbulan Jang's Dunya Aurat Ki Nazar Mein. Although both were originally travel diaries, Nazli wrote Sere Europe with the intention of publishing it as an epistolary travelogue in the women's periodical Ismat between 1910 to 11. She insisted that her writing possessed neither Ibrat Arai, something that would surprise you, or Kafiya Paimai, something that would delight you with its verse. But she wrote in her own way whatever she saw and experienced for the benefit of her compatriots, for her Ahle Watan. Begum Sarbulan Jang, on the other hand, wrote Dunya as a private diary meant to circulate only within her family, and, as has been pointed out, was published decades after the demise of her husband, whom she was accompanying on these travels. She called her account an intriguing chapter from the tale, or fasana, of her life, wherein her readers would find neither literary value, adabi khubiyan, nor poetic loftiness, but only the emotive storyteller's feelings, the jazbati afsan's feelings. These texts thus blurred barriers between public and private on their own terms. Nazli Faizi and her sister Zehra Anatia Faizi belong to the highly influential Tayyabji family, whose paterfamiliaris, lawyers and activists Badruddin and Kamruddin Tayyabji had been staunch proponents of women's education and abolition of parda. Like other women of the family, they studied at girls' school opened in Mazagaon, Bombay by the Zanana Bible Medical Mission in 1876. At a time when most Sharif women lived within the privacy of the Zanana, the Islamic fortress in the sea of hostility, the Faizi sisters enjoyed a training for public life within their homes. Atiya and Nazli, for instance, organized the Aqde Suraya necklace of plates, the Family Ladies Club, which was arranged with the intention of offering them training in organizational methods that could later be put to use in professional capacity or in national politics. This becomes relevant, as we see later, when Nazli narrates her own disappointment at the lack of women's organizations and conferences on her visit to Ottoman Turkey, because she had read about Istanbul through male reformers' accounts and expected a completely different image from what she was confronted with when she finally got there. With Begum Akhtar Hamid Sultan, who identified herself only with her husband's title, Chief Justice of Hyderabad, Nawab Hamidullah Khan Sarbulan Jang, she too, like Faizi sisters, was a part of a 300-member-strong delegation to attend the first session of the Anjuman-e-Khawateen-e-Islam at Aligarh. So there are connections and networks related to education, but with the kind of travel writing that we come across here, as Professor Lambert-Hurley had pointed out, it's less about the pan-Islamic sentiment. It's less about trying to become a part of a wider community seamlessly. Here you notice that there are Islam is as much an idiom of similarity as it is of difference, with how they negotiate their own practice and sartorial choices, particularly with the burqa, on their travel. And secondly, their interactions with these women of Istanbul, whom they're constantly trying to convince of this sisterhood. So I start with Roznamcha, Khat, and Safarnama, the genres of the akhlaqi self. According to Gail Minow, the space of 20th century women's periodicals in Urdu was a mix between education and literary content, which also became a viable means for secluded scholars to express their own views without stepping out of their home. A key concern among editors was establishing some moral authority and control over women's reading habits that manifest itself in promoting proper zanana literature and writing a regular roznamcha. The latter was to encourage them to regularly self-reflect on their day and make sure that time was not wasted and something worthy of writing was done. Here, this is a section I quote from Accessing Muslim Lives. A diary is the best cure for the disease of dementia. If you want to save yourself from embarrassment of forgetting something, then write a diary and write every day. Editors of women's journals also became arbiters of morality, of what literary taste should be. And unlike the traditional masters of poetry or ustad, they constantly engage with their readers through the relatively democratized modes of letters to the editor. Akin to literary gatherings like the Mushaira, subscribers to women's journals could collectively participate in this Mehfil-e-Tehzeeb or Bazm-e-Ismat, regular sections dedicated to letters written to the editor and fellow readers alike. Building on Jennifer Dubro's model of how journal editors place the literary periodical like Awadh Akhbar squarely in the center of modern literary culture, we see that the socio-textual community of women's periodicals too was emulating this dialogic process. So another quote I have here. This is a fine example of Shehzadi Begum, daughter of Sayyid Abdullah, whose article published in Tehzeeb-e-Niswa lamented the complete dearth of women's biographies, Sawane-Umri. You know, like, alas, there remains a devastating lack of women's biographies in Zanana literature that the dearth is such that I am speechless. Perhaps our old writers viewed writing about educational achievements and morally inspiring acts of inspirational women as much as an act of crime and sin, as these women coming out of their parda with uncovered faces. So women's periodicals has articulated the self at the center of literary pressure and moral refinement, while also giving their readers an unprecedented opportunity to determine what qualified as good Zanana literature. Then we come down to the second section, which is the travel diary. Okay, I'm conscious of my time. So explaining the context of popularity of travel writing about India in the 19th century, Peter Gottschalk characterizes the period as that of Christocentric travel writing that preached British civilization and its cultural and moral superiority over the land's Hindu and Muslim rulers. In these contexts, comparisons appear to be inherently tantamount to denigration and moralistic judgment. On the other hand, it was a travel diary inflected by religious justifications of British imperialism that flourished as the most common trope among bureaucrats and their wives and missionaries in India, South Africa, and even Arab lands. These texts aggressively influenced the image of colonial India in Orientalist literary imagination. In the world of Urdu print, the travelogue assumed a life of its own. The Hajj travelogue, for instance, emerged as a distinctly modern genre that, in Barbara Metcalfe's words, followed the trajectories of the novel and the autobiography, creating a persona from individual experiences and perceptions. In the context of Muslim politics, travelogues were also being written to critique prevailing conditions of Muslims in India, like the educationist and Islamic scholar Shibli Numani Safarnama-e-Rum Misr Sham. Although Shibli put the status of educational institutions and social and corporate lives of Muslims of the Ottoman Empire at the center of his narrative, his true concern and focus is on the community back home, to which he must return to with solutions. So, but then what becomes of Muslim women's travel writing? It held a special position in the period of so-called pan-Islamism and also European Turcophobia. Through the course of my paper, I try to portray this as less of what history has seen as a pan-Islamic grand narrative of Ummah solidarity, but more in the sense of how Muslim women themselves were critiquing this Hamidian propaganda that had spread across Urdu literary sphere. If Shibli Numani speaks of Turkey and Sultan Abdul Hamid II's reign in glorious terms as not having as something that should be portrayed in its true light, because Turks have been denigrated so much through fact and fiction that has been circulated through English writing in colonial India, that now Muslims must rise above and see the Ottoman Empire's reality for themselves. Of course, it goes unsaid that this is a period when massive texts from English are being translated regarding the Ottoman Empire into Urdu. So this has, Ottoman Empire is certainly a significant geography for people. Although the narrative again holds true for some kind of pan-Islamic sentiment within the Urdu press, we need to see this as some sort of a flow that's coming in deliberately through Hamidian press and through the kind of monetary networks that are created when these kind of popular sentiments about Abdul Hamid circulate in colonial India. But for now, we restrict ourselves to women's travelogues and how they puncture this romanticized imagination of the Ottoman Empire as a significant geography. Nazli wrote her accounts as letters to her sister Zehra Faizi, who edited and serialized them in the women's journal Isma between 1910 and 11. Her Roz Namcha was later compiled as a memoir called Sere Europe for her Hindustani brothers and sisters to think about why they did not know the many esteemed writers Islam had presented to the world and the range of topics of creativity and science, ulum of funun, that they had contributed to. Nazli's preface set the purpose of her narrative as a clarion call for Asians to invest in education of women in order to compete with European civilization. On the other hand, Begum Sarbuland's opening words established her text as a sketch, a khaka, of women from other cultures and societies. She reminded her readers of the exalted, most virtuous lives were of the women who lived in the early centuries of Islam, who neither stayed at home like women of the East, gossiping and chewing pan, and nor were they like Western women, mere objects to be enjoyed by men. So we see clearly some sort of this middle ground and a conception of the self that they are trying to create through justifications of their travel narratives. Recent scholarship around the Muslim world has unearthed a rich tapestry of itinerant Muslim emigres, bureaucrats, pilgrims, educationists, and ulama who moved to Western capitals of the empire through nodal ports of Bombay, Aden, Port Said, and Istanbul. The realities of these travels were fraught with out-of-place experiences. At ports and cities presented confusing medleys of people from far and wide, whose ambiguous identities confuse the conceptual borders between self and other. The same happens in these women's travel writing. So Nazli Faizi, when she reaches Turkey, she writes of the eventful day. So it's April 31, 1908. At long last, after entering Bosphorus and passing through Anatolia, we reach the place of my birth. Nazli's father, Hassan Allah Faizi, was a merchant who spent a large part of his life at the center of the Ottoman Empire. And both Nazli and her sister Atiya were born in Istanbul before shifting to Bombay. She points out that how her mother was the first one, apparently, to have popularized the charshaf, or the Turkish way of wearing the niqab in colonial India. Sara Europe's initial observation of Istanbul saw it as a dilapidated, almost rotten city compared to London and Paris. Its overpriced hotels, potholes, stray dogs, collapsing bridges, and general squalor made her wonder, how can this be a European city? She later took Turkish society to account over its archaic reservations against women's mobility. It was prohibited for women to even freely stroll outside their carriage in the Dolmabahce Palace's gardens. Nor could Turkish women enter hotels, nor could they walk in the streets, even with their male relatives. We had wanted to discuss Islamic traditions with you, but we are shocked at the restrictions and confinement here. So a clear contradiction to what someone like Shibli Numani had portrayed in 1894. Women had very little access to public life, and despite dressing in latest French fashions and speaking the language, they were generally unaware about the affairs of the world. Unlike educated Sharif women of colonial India, who had taken the mantle of reform and were asserting, albeit in a limited capacity, the Turkish ladies Nazli met had very little experience with political organization. So she is surprised that there are no Zanana parties or gatherings here. It is possible that this might change now, but it can be seen that even the most progressive-minded, cultivated Turkish men would never accept their ladies to participate in congregations with other men without parda. Nazli had expected a community of like-minded women who would rally behind causes of education and legal rights. What she found was French cultural, a fascination with French culture and strict parda customs. Turkish religiosity motivated segregation, and it was to such an extent for Nazli that instead of seeing Islam as a universalizing element, it became an idiom of difference. Then we come down to Nazli Faizi shuttled between Easternness, Hindi, and Muslims as markers of her identity. Begum Sarbulan confidently strut about the world as a Muslim woman. Her voyage was much lengthier and took her to the holy pilgrim site of Jeddah, Makkah, and Medina, then to Beirut, Damascus, and Turkey, and eventually Europe. Her encounters were colored by an artificial sense of Islamic familiarity in the initial stages, built around clumsily silencing that often women who became her tongue during encounters with these so-called Muslim sisters, who were Turks and Arabs, were either European or American mem sahibs. Her encounter with Turkish ladies in Istanbul, for instance, was almost a comical game of Chinese whispers. And here we are. The women in this room are wearing their hair and costumes just like memes. All these Turkish women are Muslim and are called Khanum, but no one recognizes Begum. So her English interlocutors had to justify and legitimize her own position as someone from an elite family who should be acknowledged among the ladies of Istanbul, who otherwise do not recognize any of the cultural markers that she considered universal. Although Begum Sarbulan continues asserting a common religious sense of belonging with the Turkish Khanums or Hanum, they were more interested in her genealogy. How was she a sultan? And accepted her into their fold as a Turk and not simply a fellow Muslim woman. Begum Sarbulan's journey was fraught with contradictions that are apparent in her relationship with language. She spoke English well enough to befriend mem sahibs wherever she traveled, yet when it came to Muslim sisters in Turkey, language and cultural barriers made her latch on to her genealogy. This was not the first time when Begum...
But you just have 30 seconds more. I'm sorry.
Okay. No problem. Okay, so I'll just end. In the final section, we come down to just the Turkish burqa. So there are references to how the Turkish burqa was liberating compared to the way women had restricted themselves under parda with palanquins inside their homes. So these women, even when they go out as public women, the kind of parda that they are trying to portray is that one of modern Turkey that reflects a sentiment of going out within the fold of Sharafat. So here again, although this is not the kind of sartorial choices or this is not the kind of sartorial context that they see in person when they go to the Ottoman Empire and witness how women are restricted within their own cultural systems in Istanbul, back home, on the other hand, they're trying to portray Turkish women and their way of dressing as something in which women can enjoy both pleasures of inside and outside. The reality, though, is fraught and completely different from that. So through the course of this paper, I have tried to make small attempts to just puncture certain male-dominated grand narratives of pan-Islam in which there are significant geographies. Turkey is one of them. It's all superior, and people uncritically accept its authority, both as a religious and a modern clearinghouse of modernity. Women's narratives, on the other hand, through very, very personal accounts of their interaction with the actual Turkish women, portray quite a different image. That's all.
Thank you so much, Sumaira. That was so interesting. And I think one of the biggest sort of areas of research that you're conducting and Professor Lambert-Hurley has also done is that interaction, capturing that interaction between women. I think, as a contact zone is so interesting. And there is so much to be had from sort of understanding the different ways in which women interact, which is so different and so gendered in that performance, as opposed to sort of the male-dominated narratives that exist. So that's fascinating, and especially that entire segment on the sartorial choice, looking at Turkish women and again, that hammam, the nakedness in the hammam bath, and now here with the attire is so interesting. Thank you so much. I'm going to call on Maryam Altaf now, who is a PhD candidate at the Transport Studies Unit in the School of Geography and the Environment, University of Oxford. I will be sharing her presentation and will be giving her control. So let me just do that now. Maryam, are you here?
I'm here. Thank you so much for having me today. It's really quite a wonderful platform to be hearing from so many wonderful scholars. And I would just highlight that this is very much a work in progress right now. So just bear with me as I go through the presentation. I'm going to try and keep it to time. And if the slides are ready, I can start giving a background. So within the doctoral research that I'm conducting, I'm looking at platform-based transport services, specifically in Lahore, Pakistan. And platform-based transit services are widely understood to enhance mobility for many people in the city, but they also simultaneously set the ground for a large array of exclusionary practices and social inequalities. In the spatial and cultural context of the proposed field site, which is Lahore, Pakistan, my project focuses specifically on the gendering of the opportunities, exclusions, and inequalities that are facilitated by the operation of these services. And to look at this large kind of theme of gender mobilities, I'm going to focus on 3 different themes. Thank you. I'm not sure if I can change the slide, but yeah, that's great. Thank you. So to understand, so there's 3 different themes that I'm looking at. One is provision, to understand the ways in which the provision of platform-based transport services in Lahore reproduce and reconfigure gendered mobilities. Similarly, experience is a theme that I would look at to explore how the user experience of platform and not platform-based transport services in Lahore reproduce and reinforce gender mobilities. But for this particular part of the presentation, you could say, I'm looking at representation, which is to understand how ideas about gender are reproduced and reshaped by exploring specifically the representation of mobilities in the various platform services, marketing, and communications media, and that too specifically online. So I'm analyzing visual and textual data found primarily on online social media pages for each of those companies, where so social media pages such as Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, that are circulated quite frequently by these various platform service providers in the city of Lahore. So these advertisements, I think particularly that they create a space where an imaginative space for individuals to renegotiate their gender in the real space, especially in relation to mobilities. So the analysis demonstrates the ways in which these different visual and textual representations and narratives about gender, age, class, caste, physical movement, embodiment, they all continuously reshape ideas about appropriate behavior, thereby deeming some mobility practices out of bounds for particular bodies. So there's many themes that have come out of, and many categories that have come out of thinking about this project on a larger kind of scale. Gender is a big theme. It's always difficult to speak about it, but how I'm looking at it is as a site where norms of femininities and masculinities are produced and naturalized, but also deconstructed and denaturalized. And within that, femininities and masculinities, as they're told and experienced differently in different spatio-temporal contexts, the wide-ranging femininities and masculinities that emerge in relation to specific constructions of age, class, caste, religion, and other forms of social identification. So within these large kind of wide-ranging themes in mind, a lot of other analytical categories have emerged, including what is traditional, what is modern, what is local, what is global, adulthood, bodies, youth containment, and because that's a larger part of the project, I'm just going to focus on looking at bodies specifically in terms of subversion and performativity of those bodies in relation to mobilities. And it's also maybe important to just mention that they're all understood in relation to each other and not in opposition or not as a standalone category, because sometimes some categories are more prominent in some of those visuals that I'm looking at. So of all these categories, I will only briefly discuss performative subversion. One of the key and within that, one of the key themes that has emerged is modernity, which is visualized across all the social media samples that you looked at, is the visualization of modernity through the ideas of consumption, aspiration, and desire. And these are mostly, so visually represented bodies, both female and male, are dressed and displayed to appropriately fit the idea of a modern Pakistan, which again is done through the wide and proficient use of the language of English as kind of the main advertisement language, ownership of gadgets, consumption of technology through those gadgets, as well as partaking in visibly leisurely activities such as frequenting Western style shopping malls, etc., which include again local and international consumer brands, etc. The individuals represented are also seen not simply to be reproducing Western norms in these situations, but also instead re-articulating their position within the local context, but in line with the notion of what development and national modernity means to them individually and collectively. So this displaying of experiencing modernity is also linked to class and is a marker of belonging to the middle class in contemporary Lahore. So given this association of modernity with progression and forward movement, platform-based transport services and their media agencies seem to have participated in and reinforced this logic by creating and publishing very specific advertisements on their respective social media pages. And the next slide. So advertisements across all kinds of social media, television, radio, print, billboards, all represent a specific kind of, again, modern vision with which residents then within the local space have familiar aspirations to those living in the Western countries, for example. So such aspirations are again made visible through the references to popular cafe settings, shopping malls, branded clothing, branded gadgets, etc. And examples of these references are very, very specifically seen in backgrounds used for most of these images that are produced and shared on social media online. This idea of aspiring to this abstract Western space is therefore an ideological space, a site where the understanding and where people are understanding and contesting their own identity and their ideas about modernity. So the contemporary Lahori middle class then consists of migrants from within the suburbs of Lahore, but also from largely the province of Punjab, as well as some return migrants from other countries such as the UK, US, Gulf, where they went ahead for studies, but might come back to partake in this performativity of class and within that space. So within this context, then class positions are determined by a set of specific tastes and sensibilities towards the rest of the world. And additionally, the urban planning of the city, including all kinds of its gated and non-gated areas, produces very specific spatial contours that do not necessarily determine different identities, but set the parameters for how specific identities are produced, reproduced, and in some situations reconfigured. So at both the local level and individually, collectively, class politics are a site where moral and social hierarchies are constructed in relation to discourses of progress and modernity. And within this scenario, class is continually reproduced and constructed and maintained through the social circles in which one moves and how one moves within those circles. So for example, it is widely acknowledged that middle-class female-bodied individuals, for example, should not linger in public spaces and definitely not for long. And certain visual representations also reveal self-induced censorship and policing at the same time being tied to ideas about what it means to be modern, what it means to be linked to progress and modernity within this space. So visualization of middle-class space as orderly, mapped, gated, and controlled is a reference to safe environments and renders other spaces in the city as risky or unsafe. So this politics of public space then usually categorizes female-bodied individuals into differently classed bodies as either respectful or loose, which is a term that is used quite frequently in literature. So the visually and virtually represented bodies then become sites of an aspired life, at times removed from the physical realities of various bodies and different spaces within the local context. For example, in the image on the top right, there's a female-bodied individual walking down the staircase quite modestly with their legs kept close together and arms inwards. So the body language says something, but at the same time, they're dressed in non-traditional clothing, which is a slight kind of hint towards disrupting the normative kind of behavior associated with their bodies specifically. So this understanding of containment extends beyond the body, but because it's also made clear in the spatial references that they make in the adverts. So in terms of the operational neighborhoods within the city. Next slide, please. So in terms of just generally looking at what bodies do, both female and male bodies respectively and collectively are seen to perform and act through various situations within the bounds of cultural heteronormativity. And all of this, I'm speaking within the context of what the visuals show in terms of advertisements. This heteronormativity then in turn facilitates and reinforces the emergence of feminine and masculine norms. And what's been made quite prominent across all the images is that they represent both bodies, female and male bodies are represented physically and are illustrated and normalized as ideal heterosexual bodies. So what happens is, additionally, and the reduction of existing normative scripts onto female bodies are then made quite visible in the representation of, for instance, in this image, being seated side saddled when on a motorbike, of not walking with their legs far apart, or not running on the street to catch a bus, or so thereby like displaying a containment and a control of their limbs physically. The figure of the young individual is seen as a representation of momentary freedom, or it can be seen as a representation of momentary freedom, of lacking adult responsibilities, visualized through the ownership again of gadgets or motorbikes and music players and relaxed body postures, where one is kind of taken a step away from what the realities might be in that space. In terms of looking at what, so all of these advertisements have considered or represented this age group, as one would normally say, that they're all young male or female individuals, but we're also trying to see that young or youth and adulthood is not seen as a category of just how it defines age, but as a category of discipline, and how through which normative behavior is kind of adjusted and reshaped again and reinforced within the context. Next slide, please. But across the wide range of literary and visual representation of modernity, specifically in Pakistan, as all of these notions of being half modern are seen, female-bodied individuals specifically are seen as representative of will and agency in the better interest of like an aspiring nation, as performative of a good kind of womanhood in the sense who can balance traditional roles by meeting, but also meet criteria for what it means to be a modern woman in Lahore. And this is shown across the different advertisements as somebody who takes care of care-related activities, but as well as work-related scenarios. So this desire specifically is to be belonging to a modern nation is illustrated by visually suggesting that, for instance, driving motorbikes is considered safe, acceptable, comfortable for young adult female bodies, just as they are understood and represented for male-bodied individuals. So even though they're female-bodied individuals may be seen represented in office and work settings, there is a possibility of a new sociality, but the marketing ideologies that are made more prominent seem to be reinforcing existing normative scripts onto female bodies. In the next slide, I think there is an image. Different bodies and their associated performative boundaries are then thus reproduced in this process of materialization. As in example of one performative subversion, for instance, again, young female bodies seated confidently on the back of a motorbike may see the open to air and publicly visible mode of transport as a site of subversion, which allows them to reshape and the way they experience inhabiting the city, and allowing these female bodies to take part in otherwise masculine and risky behaviors, or considered as risky and masculine, as subversively capable of enjoying the freedom and thrill of being seated on the back of a motorbike without them thinking of their bodies as vulnerable or in need of protection at all times. So the motorbike, but the motorbike then becomes, facilitates this subversion through the design of the vehicle, the alignment of the female and male bodies seated on it, which invites young female bodies to feel differently for a limited time, contrary to how they would feel normatively, or how they would normatively behave and carry themselves in relation to young male bodies in other public spaces, as well as on other modes of transport. So this alignment of bodies on the motorbike may allow for both female and male bodies to partake in this kind of momentary subversion of being in direct physical contact with a stranger's body, but then to move on to reorient themselves and correct their physical body postures normatively in relation to the space that they may find themselves at the end of or after the ride, which in a way renders the boundaries of both appropriate femininity and masculinity a little bit fluid, where female bodies, for instance, may step off this motorbike and be looking away while waiting at a bus stop, or be looking at their phone to seem distracted, or be in touch with somebody else to seem like they're not loitering about or just seemingly wandering around the urban public space. So the example of the motorbike usage could be seen as a reconfiguration of gender mobilities, but not entirely as a disruption in the normative inhabitation and experience of the local space. So additionally, I think this is important, that this positioning puts the female bodies from a certain class or embodying a certain class to come in contact with male bodies from a different class, rendering those bodies as unsafe to be around. So the figure of the young passengering body, both female and male, are thus seen as distinguishable from other working class young driver bodies. And these differences are also highlighted in different adverts by differences in skin tone between the passenger and the driver, whether these are illustrative or photographed examples. So the use of the motorbikes, again, may appear as an enabler of this reconfiguration, but at the same time, especially in relation to how male bodies are represented. In the last 10 years, Pakistan has, generally been construed as conservative, but at the same time, visual advertisements have confronted some of its customary bounds with regards to place and role of female-bodied individuals. So references but within the platform-based transfer service adverts, references to education, work, leisure are considered themes of discursive specialty, where individuals are able to insert and embody status into our everyday life practices. But at the same time, representation of individuals in relation to education and work is naturalized as the ideal type. And within these categories, the male-bodied individual is specifically naturalized as the ideal type. So this is made common across all the representations of leisure. Roaming free, hanging out, loitering are represented as masculine youth practices within a space of freedom and aspiration that is contradictory to the youth truth of their apparent economic and social placement within the class hierarchies, because it fails to link them to the consumerist ideals associated with modernity in the urban space of Lahore. And this then links it to class anxieties about new modernities that are articulated through references to education, job, self-expression, etc. So the visual analysis overall of various adverts shows that the representation of gender and mobility can be a site of process that disrupts the normative gendered experience of everyday mobility in Lahore. But at the same time, the increased visibility of heterogeneous identities and associated roles and behaviors has been made more prominent and evident across the images. Additionally, the opportunity of subversion seems to only be feasible or available for young-bodied individuals, all of whom onwards in their life course are depicted in these other advertisements as locally inevitable and normative adulthood activities such as duties of care for female-bodied individuals in the domestic space and healthcare and child-related activities. So some of the most prominent omissions from the representation of gender in these images has been the performance of queer or non-binary identities, as well as the non-representation of any disabled or differently sized bodies. Some of these bodies, such as the non-binary, may not be visibly recognizable without a substantial amount of the contextual space or the information about the space. But it's at the same time, it's also possible that advertising agencies producing the images for these transport services have deliberately perhaps chosen to exclude such non-conforming bodies, and therefore the representation of their movement within the city. So additionally, younger bodies and older bodies and families are underrepresented across these advertisements. So are movements or mobility practices represented during evening or nighttime hours. So it's all like a daytime event, particularly targeting young female bodies or male bodies. Notably, these categories specifically are, although they're all intersecting and important, they are not also neither examined as part of my analysis, because there's just a lack of presence of them in the advertisement sample. So you could say that the images may be reproducing aspirational middle-class futures, but at the same time, they're doing that by limiting the representation of movement of certain groups of people in the present time, lacking the understanding or consideration of the multidimensionality and complexity of individuals and groups of people. So these visuals, again, may be seen within a context of modern urban potentiality and aspiration, where such movement of subversion is acceptable and possible. Through discursive practices, there is a slight transgression which could lead to an active rather than a passive reproduction or reconfiguration of gender mobilities, particularly in this context. That was it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maryam. That was fascinating. And I think it's so interesting the way that you've sort of juxtaposed, on the one hand, the supposed freedom that comes with modernity, with mobility, but also the various restrictions that are placed on women in accessing this freedom. So you could be riding pillion, you could be driving your scooters, but you need to sit a certain way, you need to look a certain way, you need to be presenting yourself in a certain way. So I think it's very interesting the way that we understand agency as always a positive thing, but also there are ways in which agency can be curtailed, and it's far complicated than what we understand in terms of freedom and what modernity brings for women, which might not always be in the best interests of women, and might in a lot of ways impinge on certain existing codes of performance. So I think that was fascinating. Thank you so much. Lastly, we have Professor Nazia Akhtar, who is the assistant professor in the Human Sciences Research Group at the International Institute of Information Technology in Hyderabad. Thank you so much, Professor Nazia Akhtar, for joining us. Can you please try and share your screen?
Yes, I will just do that.
And
Okay, I don't.
We have, we're sort of short on time. So if you can sort of keep to your 20-25 minutes, that would be ideal.
Sheila, can you go ahead and share my presentation?
Okay.
Because I'm not able to figure this out. I've never seen this arrangement before.
Never mind, that's fine.
Yeah, it's not working. I will do my best, but I did prepare my presentation keeping in mind your guideline of 20 to 30 minutes, and I've kind of tended towards the 30. So yes, I will do my best. So as soon as you kind of share the slides, I can start. And in the meantime, I can thank you and Tasavvur Collective for inviting me to speak at this wonderful symposium. I don't think I've ever been so excited about a gathering like this before. And the second thing I would like to say is I've just started working on this project on Sughra Humayun Mirza just about a couple of months ago. So I'd be grateful for any comments and feedback from this audience and this panel in particular. I'm very conscious that I'm presenting this before Siobhan Lambert-Hurley, who I think in every book, starting from her book on Sultan Jahan Begum, has referred to Sughra Humayun Mirza and her work. So bearing in mind time, let me begin. Next slide, please.
I've given you control, so you can.
Oh, you have? Okay, because, oh, right, great.
Yeah.
Yes, it doesn't seem to be working. Can you see the second slide? Okay, there it is. Great. All right, so I think we've kind of sped ahead. We need to go back to slide 2. Perfect. So I think you have the controls. I'm not able to do it. So let's just keep it that way. Great. Writing in 1924, Sughra Humayun Mirza, traveling from Hyderabad, Deccan, describes with great interest a room full of mirrors that she saw at an amusement park in Berlin. एक कमरा है, उसके अंदर जाने के लिए 1 मार्क का टिकट मिलता है. इसके अंदर 1000 किस्म के आईने चारों तरफ लगे हैं. एक के सामने जाकर खड़े हो तो कद एक बालिश का दिखाई देता है. दूसरे के सामने खड़े रहो तो हम खुद एक हैं मगर सैकड़ों बन जाते हैं. किसी के सामने जाओ, हमारा सर बहुत बड़ा और न छोटा, अजब शक्ल दिखाई देती है. Fascinated and intrigued by the distortions of her reflection in these mirrors, she concludes, गरज सैकड़ों तरह से हम खुद अपने आप को देख सकते हैं. This experience where the image of the self is altered, unstable, and constantly shifting in the hundreds of different reflections that play with the nature of reality, perception, and illusion is particularly effective in helping us understand the performance of the self and subjectivity in travel, as I will show later in this paper. Next slide, please. Sughra Humayun Mirza was a reformer, educator, journalist, writer, and traveler who belonged to the erstwhile princely state of Hyderabad, Deccan. She spent her whole life campaigning for women's education and women's rights, was deeply aware of the need for Muslims to rouse themselves and work collectively towards their progress through reform, and was very concerned about the rising communal tensions between Hindus and Muslims. She demonstrated her reformist convictions in her discarding of the veil and fearlessly speaking before public gatherings, despite the censure of conservative Hyderabadi society. She was a prolific writer of not only fiction, which she used to further her reform agenda, but also poetry and non-fiction. Serialized reports of her travels in Asia and Europe were published in her literary journal, An-Nisa, before being compiled and published as books. In this paper, I examine a section of Sughra Begum's extensive 2-volume travelogue, Safarnama Europe, largely concentrating on her time in Germany in 1924, with a view to understanding her construction of self and subjectivity against a backdrop of constant movement and mobility. Anshu Malhotra and Siobhan Lambert-Hurley have argued persuasively in favor of expanding the canonical understanding of autobiography and life writing to include, and I quote, a diversity of forms, subjects, and expressions, end quote, by women that were previously excluded and othered. Such redefinition includes the genre of travel writing. This paper on Sughra Humayun Mirza's writing explores radical possibilities made available by travel in the early 20th century for the creation, consciousness, and performance of a gendered self. Next slide, please. In the process, I intend to draw on the metaphors of dreams and mirrors, both of which have been evoked in the title and the introduction to this paper, to mull over questions of seeing or perception and reflection, of reality and illusion, and what these can tell us about self and subjectivity. I want to suggest that travel itself is a dream-like state that offers a mirror to the self. I should also clarify here that by travel, I mean specifically to draw your attention to movement across space. As science fiction writer Jaideep Undurti points out, all travel is time travel. Travel propels us forward in both time and space. This paper concentrates on the politics and poetics of space and the possibilities of movement across space to articulate and perform the self. Next slide. Sughra Begum and her husband, Barrister Humayun Mirza, were accompanied for a part of their travels through Germany by her brother Baqir Ali Mirza, a student. This trip to Europe was motivated by a variety of reasons, both obligation and pleasure, in the words of Lambert-Hurley, Daniel Makrowitz, and Sunil Sharma. Part of the reason was Humayun Mirza's health. He suffered from a heart condition, and so the couple spent 2 months in Berlin, where he was treated and where he visited a doctor on a regular basis. Sughra Begum's account of her travels through Europe are based on diary entries that she wrote out using her running notes as reference. From coinage, currency conversions, and entry fees and fares of trains, ships, hotels, and museums, to basic phrases in the local language, a detailed list of how many stations or stops there were on each train journey, how many classes of seating or accommodation were present, how many rooms were booked for them, when certain museums offered free entry. Sughra Begum strives to make her account as exhaustive and comprehensive as possible. Nothing is too small for her notice, and the diligence in recording facts and details is remarkable. As Makrowitz has pointed out, Sughra Begum's tone in this travelogue is conversational from the outset, as if she directly addresses her readers, who would know her quite well through her prolific writing and journalism. The tone is vibrant and immediate, and often intimate and vulnerable too. It is clear that, among other things, Sughra Begum intended for it to be a guidebook for her readers, as well as a rich reading experience full of the delight of detail for the majority who would not be traveling to Europe. She describes how to get a train pass made, what this looks like, how it is to be used, when and where it is valid. She explains things that she knows that her Parda Nashin readership would not be familiar with. She puts words that she is sure they would not know within parentheses and tries to find Indian equivalents for others. Perhaps with the intent of making other colleagues aware of this scheme, she writes in precise detail about the special arrangements that the German government makes to show foreign editors and writers around the country, free of charge, provided they have prior notice of their arrival and plans. The workings of a dedicated journalist constantly considering her reader are evident from these narrative details and glossing choices. Despite this, at times overwhelmingly thorough account, there are occasions when Suhra Begum expresses her failure to write about a particular place because her pen is simply not equipped to do justice to its craftsmanship or beauty. On these occasions, she digresses from her detailed descriptions and journalistic tone and goes off into raptures, concluding, for example, on one instance, that only angels in heaven could build such things of beauty as the Kaiser's palace. Wah, wah, kya pyara pyara, she exclaims in delight in another instance. On some occasions, she resorts to quoting Persian poetry to better convey how she feels. A distinctly literary tone appears in her writing also when she is particularly moved by the beauty or drama of fleeting moments, such as on one enchanted night in Berlin, when a duck with her 6 ducklings slips onto the surface of a lake, which sends ripples through the liquid reflection of a sky full of synchronized fireworks. Her account gives us rare but strikingly frank and penetrating insights into the conditions in which this account was produced and the process she used to get it together. She tells us that she adhered religiously to a routine of preparing these entries before bedtime, no matter how busy her day had been, full of sightseeing, invited or solicited visits to institutions, medical appointments, and social calls to and from various Hyderabadis, Indians, and Iranians. We learned that she made notes continuously while guides or managers showed her around the places she visited. These guides or managers spoke in German, and it was her brother Baqir Ali Mirza, who knew a little German, who would translate for her. When she returned home, she would rewrite everything in her diary. Next slide, please. The resultant account contains 2 kinds of entries. There are those that deal extensively with the daily business of living in and seeing and experiencing another country. The second kind consists of thematic entries that verge on essays, providing accounts and analyses of the places she visited that were particularly close to her heart and her work. These were the educational institutions, maternity homes, homes for orphans and destitute or poor people, which she was specifically shown on request by a German government department in charge of such tours. These entries are more circumspect and, given the more analytical and thoughtful tone and pace in them, appear to have involved more rewriting and editing on Suhra Begum's part. Throughout the account, it is possible to measure the toll that the rigors of seeing and describing these places on the go in such meticulous and feverish detail takes on her. This is demonstrated in, first, the writing itself, so that the unvarying details of the everyday aspects of travel and meeting people or seeing the same kind of grand, ornate, well-decorated royal dwellings or rich museum collections often get tedious and repetitive. The individuality of rooms, paintings, museums, and galleries gets somewhat blurred as her penchant for detail falters and flags along with her energy. One can sense from her tone that she too is tired, but persists through the motions for the sake of completeness and symmetry. It is possible to see this in orthography and structure. There is no sense of paragraph shift, as one paragraph can deal with widely varying subjects at breathtaking speed and no transitions to prepare the reader for these sudden shifts. For instance, she moves abruptly from intense, rigorously analytical discussions on the roles and conditions of women and the perceptions of women as German citizens and nation builders to the way shops look and are arranged in the country. The unique orthographic practices of Urdu writing in print also complicates this reading for a reader more used to English, for while there are usually periods between sentences, there is no punctuation of the kind we are now so accustomed to seeing in English writing and print. There's also a connection here, I think, to orality and oral and performative genres, which lent a lot to Urdu prose, early Urdu prose, which I don't have time to go into and which we can possibly discuss in the Q&A if there's time to do that. Second, she writes openly and frankly of her exhaustion, as she constantly pushes herself to see and write more and more, but is forced to put her pen down and feet up on more than one occasion. One of these reflections is especially insightful. Next slide, please. Unable to see the Kaiser's palace on the same day that she visited a large museum collection, she rues. Thak gayi. We will go to see it on another day, she adds. And then she writes, थकूं या कुछ हो, लिखना तो जरूरी है. लिखने की फिक्र तो एक ऐसी जान के साथ लगी हुई रहती है कि कोई चीज बेफिक्री से देख नहीं सकती. देखती जाती हूँ, उसी वक्त लिखती जाती हूँ. फिर घर पर आकर डायरी में उतार लिया करती हूँ. On another occasion, she says, next slide, please. कमरे में फिरते फिरते तबीयत थक कर चूर हो गई है और अगर कलम हाथ में ना हो तो सैर का लुत्फ भी आए. दिल अलग परेशान रहता है कि कहीं कुछ बात छूट न जाए. जो देखूं वो लिखती जाऊं. जर्मनी जुबान में वो औरत कहती जाती थी, उर्दू में मैं लिखती. दूसरों से दरियाफ्त करती जाती. यूं क्या लिख रही थी, कहां पहुंच गई. कैसर के पलंग के कमरे के बराबर एक छोटा सा कमरा है जहां कैसर सुबह को चाय पीता था. Apart from the personal toll that this arduous process takes on her, what is also significant here is her all-consuming desire and anxiety to see everything, find out everything, and miss nothing of it when she communicates it to her reader. There is an intriguing and voracious appetite to this restless quest that severely and critically undermines and threatens to destabilize the hegemonic idea of the traveler, male, European, virile and energetic, the colonizer, against which both the East and Eastern, particularly Muslim women, have been negatively defined and othered. Her pursuit for information, knowledge, and understanding is radical and politically powerful and speaks back and inverts the European colonizers' exercise of power through knowledge. Next slide, please. In some ways, thus, that hegemonic conception of the traveler and travel writing becomes a foil to the personality and writings of Sughra Humayun Mirza, and her insatiable personal curiosity and her relentless sense of duty, social, political, and literary, to her readers. The personality that emerges from her account annihilates the silencing and assumed silence of Muslim women as travelers, writers, and indeed as subjects with agency. Next slide, please. Another striking aspect of this account that stands out and is both socially and politically significant, as well as revealing of her performance of self, is Sughra Begum's acute awareness and meticulous documentation of space, size, scale, and dimension. I have already highlighted the passage about the room with mirrors and how she reports its distortions of her sense of space, of depth and size, throwing her perception of reality into question, blurring it with reflection and illusion. She also comments on both natural landscapes as well as the interiors and exteriors of public buildings and monuments, and is deeply observant and conscious of where and how she stands with reference to them being in them. She's endlessly fascinated with German forests and trees and is intrigued by their size, density, color, composition, and technologies of preservation. She comments on the size and grandeur of buildings and always communicates how she feels in a space, what it constitutes, what the layout is like, how many floors there are, which direction, right or left, up or down, leads to which room, gallery, or ward, what the size of an oil painting is, what is the size of the wall on which it is suspended, the size of statuary, how big a garden or a fountain is, how many steps it takes to get to a particular view, how many sculptures there are on the front facade of a building, what kind of a staircase does it have, how many stops it takes to get to a particular railway station, whether the train went slowly or fast, whether the landscapes on the way were open or thickly cultivated or populated, whether there were many or few stations that passed before her destination, etc. I argue that Sughra Begum's particular preoccupation with space, size, depth, and dimension in Germany proceeds from the way her life as a woman from a Parda society, where space is strictly gendered, structures her way of being and moving through space, leading to the creation of a particular mentalite with respect to space. Sughra Begum did discard Parda later in her life, but her veiling practice prior to that depended on context. She discusses the difficulties of traveling in Parda and posed for pictures of herself in a long European dress, which I had included in this. It's a very blurred reproduction that I was able to get from Rekhta books. So she's dressed in a long European dress and shoes and a waist-length veil, which completely covers her face and upper body. She also maintains other aspects of Parda practice in her time in Europe, refraining, for example, from attending dinner parties where there were only men and boys present. At the same time, she does not veil when she goes to meet the Caliph, the deposed Ottoman Sultan Abdulmajid II in Zurich. Her lived reality as a Parda Nashin woman ensures this acute, almost intuitive consciousness and awareness of space, which is built into her person. As Hannah Papanek and Gail Minogue have pointed out, Parda is a system of ideas and actions, manifesting not only in literal or physical manifestations of segregation, but in figurative ways. And I would add, in terms of how thought and perception are structured and felt. The body moves differently in a Parda society, as writers and scholars of Parda, such as Samina Ali and Farzaneh Milani have pointed out. Milani writes vividly in the case of Iran that it is not only women's bodies that are veiled, but, and I quote, the concrete, the specific, and the personal are also veiled. Communication is veiled, words and feelings are veiled, end quote. Negotiating space, especially public space with its possibilities and obstacles, its refuges and taboos, is arguably something that Parda Nashin women have to be particularly conscious of, because it came with taboos and consequences if those taboos are violated. Indeed, the female body has to and is expected to move differently in any patriarchal society, as Shilpa Phadke, Samira Khan, and Shilpa Ranade have pointed out in their path-breaking book, Why Loiter? And I think Samira Khan is here today, just scrolling through the participants, and I saw her name there. And I'm so grateful that Maryam brought this up. This is a very kind of convenient segue into the point I'm trying to make, although it's from a very different time period. Negotiating streets, public offices, public spaces requires a specific gendered awareness on the part of women and even girls. I think Sughra Begum's careful documentation of space and dimension and how she makes sense of them and negotiates them proceeds from this gendered awareness of not only most women, but women who either maintain Parda or generally belong to a society structured along Parda lines. Next slide, please. Significantly, she also makes observations about many things, including space, shape, size, appearance, and dimension, that estrange Europe from the universal sense of familiarity or communion with which it is often treated by Western travelers, as if Europe is the natural default among all ways of living, being, and seeing. She observes that all Germans look like each other and have round heads. Detached and aloof, she stands over different European nations, happily comparing them and making broad generalizations. She writes that the Germans look totally different from the British, and that unlike the French, beauty is not common among them. Husn France ki tarah aam nahi hai. She observes that unlike Indians, Iranians, or Arabs, there is no mixing of race or nation, nasl or qawm, among the Germans. And she observes, and this is an observation which is, very meaningful, in an ominous auguring of what is to come from and out of that country over the next couple of decades. When you go into a small shop, these people advance speaking rapidly, she writes, somewhat alarmed, and you think that they're fighting, but actually this is just the way they talk. She points out that men are smaller in London, but the horses are large and fat. In contrast, in Germany, the men are taller, but the horses are small. She also makes pointed comments about language. Her descriptions simplify and as a result caricature German, French, and English languages, stripping them of complexity and taking away the lofty grandeur with which they are associated and celebrated by their national poets. About French, for example, she writes, France में yes की जगह oui करते हैं. German, she writes, is a very harsh language. Her work renders Europe the other in the world of her familiar, performing thus a kind of resistance in reading historically. I'm certain that this was not intended consciously or oriented deliberately ideologically on her part, but nevertheless, the possibilities for such reading are embedded in the text. One must read resistance, as Rajeshwari Sundararajan reminded us decades ago, explaining that, and I quote, the discovery of resistance in women's writing also requires the investment of our desires and the acknowledgement of our politics as women/feminists reading. I argue, therefore, that the way Sohra Begum experiences the strangeness of Europe as an outsider makes for particularly productive reading, acquiring a resistive quality by the colony, the margins speaking to the center, resisting the irresistible omniscience and omnipotence of the hegemon. Last slide, please. It is also this strangeness of Europe, in addition to the beauty and glamour of its places and of its palaces and forests, that makes it a dreamlike experience. Describing the end of her time in London and looking forward to traveling to other places in Europe, Sohra Begum writes, London का ख्वाब अब तमाम हो चुका, गोया हमने एक ख्वाब देखकर आंखें खोली, यहाँ से दूसरा ख्वाब शुरू होता है. In fact, not only is it the particular strangeness of Europe, but the experience of travel itself that is dreamlike. Travel, like dreams, engages affect by presenting the unfamiliar and unpredictable, where orienting oneself can be intuitive but also difficult, where full assimilation of experiences and their reality can be elusive and evade the subject. And as always, as Edward Said and other scholars working on this question have pointed out, the self is reflected and mirrored against the image of the other. Sohra Humayun Mirza's characterization of travel as a dream allows us to explore the strangeness and alterity of travel as an experience and what that can tell us about the self. A strange and alternate state of being, travel is also a mirror which casts the self in different forms, forcing the articulation and performance of the self through inverted relief. The poetics and politics of space is in this regard an instructive example, so that Sohra Begum's perception and preoccupation with space, depth, size, and dimension are structured by her upbringing in a society where movement is gendered and defined by segregation. Furthermore, her urge and all-consuming desire to see everything, capture everything, and omit nothing disrupts the enforced invisibility of Muslim women and Muslim women travelers in the Eurocentric discourse of travel writing, as well as the vast body and mode of Orientalist knowledge and thought, respectively, which are notorious for their fetishized silencing of Muslim women. In the process, Sohra Humayun Mirza's travel accounts and their construction and performance of herself offer opportunities of reading that can contribute to, first, the extension of our understanding of the radical possibilities that travel writing offers as a source of Muslim women's life writing or autobiography, and second, the creation of a more inclusive and radical discourse of travel writing, restoring the Muslim woman to the history of this genre, expanding and reconfiguring the contours of this genre in the process, and speaking back to power. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And I sort of particularly liked what you mentioned about, not only women obviously experiencing space, and their experience of space is derived from their experience of living in space. But I'm also sort of interested in how there is also, as a result of that, gendered observation in the way that women observe things differently. And especially with the explicit sort of detail with which Sughra Begum has written everything from, the stops. And I'm sort of very curious to see if in that detailed account, we can sort of gather something that is explicitly, again, gendered. Whether for the better or not, what that tells us about women traveling at such a time when it wasn't the norm. So thank you so much for that. And I also just want to tell everyone that Professor Akhtar's book has just been published in July. It's called Bibi's Room, Hyderabadi Women and 20th Century Urdu Prose. There it is in all its glory. So again, please go buy it. Please order it for your libraries. I think it's such a sort of rich collection again, just like Lambert-Hurley's collection, in that it's tapping into something that hasn't been looked at before. Hyderabadi women, when talking about Muslim women, are also sort of not really spotlighted. And I think it's so interesting what you're doing. So thank you so much. I am obviously conscious of the time. So before I know that we have one question from the audience, but before that, I just like to ask a question of my own because I can. So I want to talk about vehicular gender. It's something that I'm looking at. It's a term by Sidoni Smith, in the book Moving Lives. And I think it broadly sort of connotes to this fundamental way of traveling, which is differently experienced by women, or by any gender, even the masculine sort of experience, and that there is a particular